Well, good morning if you are in Seattle, Washington. Good afternoon if you are in Houston, Texas, or Charleston, South Carolina, New York City, New Jersey, for that matter. Good evening if you are in London or in Egypt. Greeting to people all over the world. Welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Idagio, the place where classical music happens. Idagio, as you all know by now, is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and making classical music and opera available to fans all around the world. My guest today is a gentleman I've never met, I've never spoken to. I know of his work, I know of his reputation, I know people who have worked with him, but we've never had the chance. Mena Mark Hanna, General Director and CEO of Spoleto Festival USA, joins me from Charleston, South Carolina. Welcome, Mena.
Thank you, Fred. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, we're going to go back in time a little bit before we get you to Spoleto USA, we will eventually describe what's the difference between Spoleto USA and Spoleto Italy in terms of arts festivals. But you are a musician, you are a composer, you've taught composition, you are an arts administrator. One of the things that I'd like to work through with you today is how those things can all be done together, and whether your mind is the same mind for each of those activities or whether it shifts in different ways depending what you're doing. But I know that you were born in London of Egyptian parentage. Where in Egypt is your family from?
My mother is from Cairo and my father's from Alexandria. They're both Coptic, so they're part of the Christian Orthodox minority in Egypt.
Yes. And so get right to that point. You're doing Thaises here in
That's right.
Spoleto.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's something I wonder why. Well, that's something else we can talk about. um, Listeners will find out why we're laughing about that. Um, I've been to Egypt. I've worked in Egypt. It's a fascinating country. Um, I worked mostly in Luxor,
Oh wow.
Hatshepsut, and Cairo, but one of my great dreams in life was to go to Alexandria. So that
Hmm.
as part of my contract, after my contracted work for the South or up the Nile, as they say, I insisted that I get 5 days in Alexandria just because I really wanted to go there. And one of my strongest memories in life was the road trip north, going from crowded, magnificent Cairo and
Hmm.
what we think of as classic Egypt,
Hmm.
seemingly up and up. I don't think it was not a mountain, but somehow I remember the brown soil, a little bits of green here and there, and
Hmm.
suddenly this horizontal band of blue appeared before my eyes. And that was the Mediterranean as we were approaching Alexandria. It was heart stopping in terms of
Yeah.
it was just
I
an
think the
amazing sight.
Yeah, the Mediterranean, there's a historian named Tamim Ansari that wrote a fantastic book called History Disrupted, which is about trying to look at the world from an Eastern perspective, specifically from an Islamic perspective. He wrote a lot in the aftermath of the Iraq and Afghan wars and the war on terror, so on and so forth. And he describes the Mediterranean world as kind of like the grand central station of the ancient world. Like it's where it was a mode of transportation. It was also a life-giving force for that entire basin. And that's very much part of my sort of upbringing. I always find myself kind of pulled back to the Mediterranean. My wife, who's Irish, loves the Mediterranean as well. We spent time in Greece, we spent time in the south of France, things like that. And there is something about that part of the world which just sort of feels civilizationally fecund. And it's just kind of an exciting place to be from.
Well, I think part of what captured, I mean, I had read Jan Morris, I'd read Lawrence Durrell, I'd read a lot of the writers about
Right.
Alexandria, I read Shakespeare. My
Yeah.
favorite Shakespeare play is Antony and Cleopatra, which
Yeah.
when people ask me what's your favorite Shakespeare play, I say guess. After 10 guesses, they still don't get Antony and Cleopatra, which surprises me because to me, it's a great play. It's the best female character in Shakespeare, in my
Mm,
view. And therefore there's a lot to love, but it's somehow the play that people don't seem to remember because they name the tragedies from the British-based tragedies or the Italian tragedies and
right.
comedies, but not this one. And but I because I was in Egypt for 5 weeks before seeing the Mediterranean, a sea that I know very well, but I began to associate water and life giving with this vertical entity called the Nile.
Mm,
And
that's right.
I,
Also
I
a life-giving force.
my
Yeah.
first Egyptian culture exposure in Egypt was the life along the Nile, the felucca
Mm,
boats that transported me across Luxor. And it was just fascinating, but removed from the colors that I knew. And that's why when suddenly I reached Alexandria and the colors that I knew returned, um, it was just thrilling.
yeah.
And it remains one of my great experiences was staying in Alexandria. Much though I loved all of Egypt, but
Yeah.
somehow I was prepared for Alexandria because of my studies and interests. Um, I have very good friends from Alexandria since then who are Coptic Christians, and it's a fascinating culture that we can talk about a bit later when we talk about Thais. But you grew up, you were born in London, but you grew up in New Jersey in the United States.
Hmm.
Where in New Jersey?
In South Jersey, Mount Laurel, Morristown, that area. Yeah.
Okay. Um, which when people who don't know New Jersey think of New Jersey, they think either of the stereotypes, the
Yeah.
Sopranos, the Frank
Yeah.
Sinatra, the Bruce Springsteen, the accents, and so on, or they realize that it's actually a very diverse state for a very
It
small
is.
that
Yeah.
has two poles. One of them is drawn toward Philadelphia, the other toward New York
Correct.
City.
Yeah.
And so people think of it as a sort of a transit state as well between New York and Philadelphia. But New Jersey has great universities. It has superb
Hmm.
agriculture. A
Hmm.
lot of
It
the best
does.
food that comes to New York and Philadelphia comes from New Jersey.
Yeah.
And the blueberries, the tomatoes, things like that. It
The
has
cranberries. You can't
the
forget the
cranberries.
cranberries.
It has a beautiful shoreline. It has mountains. It
Mm.
has a lot. And when you tell people that you're from New Jersey, what is the first response you get?
It's normally it's funny because I think the response is dependent upon where I am. When I was living in Berlin or living in the UK or in France, I would say New Jersey, and people would want to know, oh, you mean like New York? They would immediately assume that it's sort of a suburb of New York or something like that. And you'd have to be a little bit more specific. And I, especially when I was studying for my master's and doctorate in the UK, during which I spent some time living in Paris as well. I became enormously kind of like proud of being a Philadelphian, specifically a Philadelphian emigre or a Philadelphian exile. So got really into Philadelphia sports and like some Philadelphian music, not just a Philly orchestra, but some rap groups too. And was like very proud of it. Uh, and here in Charleston, you know, there are a lot of New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia transplants here right now. I think it's also a new wave of migration after the pandemic. Um, and a lot of people around here, there is like a big, Philly sports community. So like there are a lot of people that are going out to bars and watching Eagles games and things like that,
Mhm.
which I didn't really expect in Charleston. Um, so it depends on where you are. I think the most common association is The Sopranos, probably,
Yeah.
and
More than
or
Sinatra and Bruce Springsteen or Meryl Streep and Federico and Shatter from New Jersey.
right, right, or Jon Stewart. There's a
Jon Stewart,
whole
yeah,
bunch of yeah, a whole bunch of
right.
people. So I agree. And then the funny thing too is thinking about New Jersey as this place that I think was very descriptive in the movie Lean on Me, which took place in Paterson, New Jersey,
Yeah.
which was this kind of like rough industrial place. And the place of the parts of New Jersey that I grew up in are pretty leafy and pretty green.
Yeah.
And we would go over the bridge to Philly and go a couple miles north and be in Princeton, or take the train up to New York, and it was a pretty nice sort of green suburban lifestyle
Yeah. With a beautiful coastline as well.
with a beautiful coastline. And I definitely grew up going to the Jersey Shore, and it's not the Mediterranean, but I'm proud of
No, it's not the
it.
Mediterranean, but it has a lot to recommend it. Um,
Mm.
so I want to take because Adagio is based in Berlin, and
Hmm.
you have a significant life period in Berlin. I want to
I
talk
do.
about your Berlin years because you and I have some overlap with that, but also because what I know that you did is really fascinating. I haven't had a guest yet who has spoken about what you did in Berlin. You were there, if I'm correct, from 2014 to 2021, more or less,
Spot on. Yeah, that's right.
and a lot of this time was spent at the Barenboim Said Academy
The entirety of it was.
the
Yes.
entire time. And I
Yeah.
know geographically exactly where that is. And as I said, you and I have never met, but I was working right there in 2018,
Hmm.
across at the opera and down the street. I mean, I was working right there, and I passed your building every day. I have a couple of friends who have worked there, and so therefore I know about it, but I only set foot in the door once. Please tell us. I know we know who Daniel Barenboim is. Maybe not everybody knows who Edward Said was. Did you ever meet
Hmm.
Edward Said?
I didn't. I was close to his widow, or I am close to Mariam
Yeah.
Said and to his family, but I never had the opportunity to meet Edward Said. He passed away before I really became intellectually familiar with his works. Uh, but when I was doing my doctoral dissertation, which was on Coptic chant, actually,
Mhm.
at Oxford, a lot of that work was indebted to Edward Said's framework and the way he looked at the world.
I went to Columbia for graduate school, and he was part of the very important part of the environment of Columbia. I have a very good friend who you might know. She's a Coptic Christian. Her name is Nimet Habashi,
Nimet
and
Habashi.
is a very good friend of mine. And she is very close to Said's widow and knew Edward very, very well. And I knew him and met him through her primarily, but also through my studies at Columbia. Um, Talk about him, about his work, about his influence, and his impact on Daniel Barenboim, the conductor and pianist.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a difficult topic to talk about right now. And I think this whole project in Berlin, I was hired to be the founding dean of the Barenboim Said Academy, which is kind of the brick and mortar realization of the West Eastern Divan Orchestra, which was an orchestra that was co-founded by Daniel Barenboim and Edward Said. Daniel Barenboim being an Argentinian Israeli Jew, and Edward Said being a Palestinian literary critic, and they founded it together in an attempt to build some kind of common understanding through music, and a lot of this is kind of framed around this concept of counterpoint, which is a term we know in music very well. You can have two effectively extant melodies that have rhythmic and melodic independence, but they play together when they are combined, and that combination produces a richer, more fulfilling, spectacular work. And that contrapuntal idea that you can have things that seem oppositional but actually in concert or symphonic is something that I think Edward and Daniel really believed in, and believe in. And really tried to see come to fruition through the West Houston Divan Orchestra and then the Barenboim Said Academy. So the Divan Orchestra was an orchestra, or is an orchestra. It still tours, it's still active. Um, that was founded in 1999, and was founded in Weimar when it was the European culture of, or capital of culture, excuse me.
I didn't hear
Uh,
the town where it was founded.
Weimar, Germany.
Weimar, Germany.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
So it was founded in Weimar, and it was the European capital of culture. It was founded partly because of the assistance of the German cultural minister at the time, a man named Michael Naumann, who was the first German cultural minister of unified Western and Eastern Germany. And his career was also interesting. He used to be a journalist and then became a publisher and became a public intellectual of some renown in Germany, and also earned a reputation amongst certain power brokers in places like the UK and the US. And when he was hired as the cultural minister under Gerhard Schröder, the British newspaper, The Sun, ran a headline saying, Germany hires first cultural minister since Goebbels. So they didn't like him very much.
But we have to put in context what the sun is. The sun as the newspaper is not illuminating. Let's leave it at that.
But I think that's a fine way to put it. Naumann actually put the seed funding for the West Houston Divan Orchestra, and it reconvened, I think, again in 2001, and there it really started to achieve some fame as a project, an orchestra of Arabs and Israelis that are bound together by a common love and understanding of music, Western art music, classical music, and can kind of show a glimmer of hope where politics and discourse may fail. Something is happening in the arts that is not failing. And it is something that, when I first became aware of the project, when I read a lot of Edward Said's work, and then his work that he did with Daniel, Parallels and Dialogues specifically, which was a set of interviews that were conducted by Ira Gazilinian. I was just totally compelled by the whole project.
So for
And
people who don't
so
know, Eric Guzlimian for many years was a dean at Juilliard, and before that was in California, as I recall. And in addition to his being an academic administrator at Juilliard, did a lot of public interview, as I do. It's the same. We're the same kind of guys, actually. Um, Conversations with people in the arts and politics and culture to try to bring forth ideas that perhaps don't come forth in heated debate.
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there is this kind of beauty that you can have a string quartet of a Palestinian, an Israeli, an Iranian, and an Italian, and have them perform a remarkably compelling, you know, rendition of Opus 132 or something like that by Beethoven.
As
Uh,
long as the Italian's the first violin.
I know we had a fantastic first violinist for most of the time when I was at the Barenboim Said Academy, Yamin Saidi, who is now at the Wiener Philharmoniker,
Yes.
and is the first. So I mean, there's it turned into a really remarkable project, first as an orchestra, and then in 2012, I was working at Houston at the time. I was then the assistant artistic director of Houston Grand Opera, and was a sort of musicology fellow on faculty at Rice. I also taught some courses at Rice. And Michael Naumann reached back out to me. I had first met him while I was at Oxford. He was the stepfather of a good friend of mine. We had a night of incredible conversation and friendship and camaraderie and just intellectual life and verve and vigor and all the things you want when you meet someone like that. And we had a conversation, and he came back in 2012 and said, Daniel's trying to start this academy, the Barenboim Said Academy. What do you think about it? And at that point, I had just been in Houston for a year, and I said, "Well, I'm pretty new here. I need to see what's going on here. I really love my work here, and I'm really invested in producing opera. Um, and he kind of kept coming back to me and kept coming back to me, and then in 2013, they flew me out to Abu Dhabi and then to Sevilla to sort of spend time with the West Houston Divan Orchestra and have a series of conversations with Daniel, which were also followed up by some conversations we had together at Carnegie Hall when he was performing there with the West Houston Divan Orchestra. That might have been 2012, actually. And those conversations turned into a curriculum and sort of a vision for the Barenboim Said Academy that I was tasked with creating, that I did with Daniel, and also with Michael. So Michael, or Mike as I call him affectionately, was the academy's first rector. So we all kind of bound together and built this institution that was majority funded by the German federal government, which is highly unique because people think that funding for the arts in Germany is something that just happens at the snap of the finger. But actually,
Oh,
it doesn't. And a lot of the things that are funded in Germany are institutions that are very deeply rooted, and they are normally funded at a state level.
yeah.
So to have something that was funded at a federal level, that was a third Musikhochschule, a third music conservatory in Berlin after Hans Eisler and the UDK, the Universität der Kunst, was something that was significant, especially to fund it so that we could also build a concert hall that was designed by Frank Gehry that's attached to it, that became the
Right.
Pierre Boulez Saal.
I just want to clarify a couple of things for listeners who are not
Sure. Sorry, I'm
German
going
based.
quickly.
No, you're good. Who are not German based. When you said the state level, it's kind of like in the United States, we have 50 states. Germany has 16 Länder or states or regions or provinces, whatever you want to call them. And then there's the Federal Republic of Germany. A question I have for you that I never thought of because it was not framed to me this way. If this was just as Germany was reuniting and the idea of the Western Germany and Eastern Germany being brought together as one political entity. When I always thought of the Western Eastern Divan Orchestra, I thought of Israel, Palestinians, Jews, Arabs, whatever, Muslims. But could there have been some echoing resonance for Eastern and Western Germans?
I think in the most optimistic perspective of the West Houston Divan Orchestra and the Barenboim Said project, it it is it does take kind of a cue from the reunification of East and West Germany. And I think that's partly why, part of this is circumstantial. Daniel made his most of his career in life in Berlin and was also someone who took it upon himself to really actually revitalize and rehabilitate the East German institution that really fell into disrepair and needed the most work, after reunification, that of the Staatsoper unter den Linden.
Yeah.
So I think Daniel saw in his work and life's work in Germany a possibility of reunification, a possibility to uh, potentially tear down the walls and disparities that can exist in cultures that are actually so intertwined. And I think that's kind of the fundamental truth of Palestinian and Israeli culture is that it is deeply intertwined.
Sure.
So I think he saw the analogies very clearly. He sees the analogies very clearly. And I think Michael Naumann does as well. He sees the analogies very clearly. So I think that's part of the reason why they were able to make a compelling case for federal funding for the Barenboim Said Academy and federal funding for an organization that is both an an educational institution of higher learning and a cultural institution is rare on both counts. I mean, you have things like the Max Planck Institute in Germany, which are federally funded. But it's not common to get federal funding for higher education sort of institutions. It's also not common to get federal funding for cultural institutions. I mean, I think really the only other one that gets some federal funding is Bayreuth. So
Yeah.
the Barenboim Said Academy is in a very unique position within the German federal funding ecosystem.
Um, I've never known what the divan is in the name of the orchestra. It's not a sofa, I don't think.
No, it's named after Goethe's volume, the Westöstliche Divan. So
Ah.
Goethe wrote in the early 19th century an incredible volume of poetry that was his attempt at what he called Weltliteratur, world literature. He was deeply taken by the work of Hafiz, the Persian Sufi poet, who
Mhm.
wrote works in a divan, a divan is at the time, in Farsi, it's like a combination of poems or a collection of poems, and so his work, the Westöstliche Divan, was kind of a reflection of Hafiz's own divan works.
Mhm.
And I think part of this, is also due to the fact that Weltliteratur and um, and this world interaction uh, in the late 18th, early 19th century was fundamental to the perspective and framework of Goethe living in Weimar. So this
Mhm.
all goes back to Weimar being the cultural capital of Europe in 1999.
Weimar, I think, would like to think of itself as the cultural capital of Europe every year. It can take some claim to that. I mean, Liszt was very prominent there
That's
and
right.
advocated for the works of Wagner when Wagner in 18 May of 1849 suddenly had to flee Saxony for Switzerland because he was a
That's right.
rebel. And
Yeah.
he had just completed Lohengrin, which is one of my very favorite operas. And it was Liszt who got Lohengrin produced for its premiere in Weimar that Wagner never saw. And it was many years
Yeah.
later that he finally saw and heard Lohengrin in a theater in Germany.
Yeah, I mean, Weimar was like basically the center of German Enlightenment in the 18th century,
Yeah,
especially, and that's with Goethe, that's with also with Friedrich Schiller, and
right.
then Liszt is attracted to Weimar because of that reputation, and its center of a place of culture, and then in the 20th century, Weimar became an incredibly
Public,
important
yeah,
place for visual artists and architects. I mean, it
yeah.
was the founding place of the Bauhaus
Oh,
movement.
wow.
So you have people like Walter Gropius and Paul Klee and like Vasily Kandinsky. So all spent significant amounts of time in Weimar.
By the way, do you know where Liszt is buried?
No.
He's buried in Bayreuth, but not because his daughter Cosima was married to Richard Wagner. He's buried in Bayreuth because he put something in his will that I've never seen before or since in a will, namely that he was to be buried in the city, town, place where he died, wherever that happened to be. And that's a risky proposition.
I
Because,
but I isn't there the so he was buried in Bayreuth, but
but
isn't there
not
those?
not where the
Oh, right, you're
Wagners
right.
are. He's
No,
buried
no,
in
no,
a
that's right,
cemetery.
because Wagner died in Venice,
Yes,
and there are those incredible pieces by Liszt, La Lugubre Gondola, where
right.
Liszt has these crazy like premonitions of Wagner's death, and then writes these pieces, really
Hmm.
strange kind of modernist piano pieces, almost miniatures, that are these funerary processions of gondolas that
Yes.
that are holding Wagner's body. And he wrote these pieces in like 1883 or 1885, something like that. Really
Well,
weird
Wagner
pieces.
died February 13th, 1883. So,
So it was 1883 that he wrote them.
right.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
And
And
Wagner was
then
buried in
Liszt
San
died in
Michele,
1880. Liszt
Liszt,
died in 1886, right? Just a couple
yes,
years later.
he
Yeah.
died
Okay.
after, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so even though he was older than Wagner, he outlived
That's
Wagner
yeah.
and had his daughter there, Cosima, who lived on into the 20th century. And
Right.
that's the story of the Bayreuth Festival we could do another time. But I just find it so interesting. Imagine if all of us in the world were buried in the places where we died, as
Yeah,
opposed to
it's
where we
a
wanted to be
fantastic
buried.
thought experiment. Yeah.
It
I mean,
is. It really.
yeah, I don't really, I don't really think about that, like where one's final resting spot should be and where it feels appropriate.
I've thought a lot about it, and I've made plans because I don't want to wind up like Liz. Nothing wrong with Bayreuth, but I mean, if I were to die in Bayreuth, okay. But um, I'm a little more. I mean, without getting too detailed, I'm not going to be buried. I'm going to be cremated, and I know where my ashes will go. That
Sure.
my executor will take care of, but I'm not saying it publicly. But
Would you rather be buried or cremated in Venice or in Bayreuth?
neither actually. Thank you very much. I mean, all right, it's a recipe. I've written 8 cookbooks. It's a recipe. Half of me will be in a place in New York, and the other half will be in a place in Italy, and that's all I'm going to say.
Okay, all right. I don't want to
But
pry.
no, sir, I'll tell you some other time. But anyway, talk please about the activities of the Barenboim Said Academy, and talk please about Edward's books that particularly influenced you, because they certainly influenced me, and I know they influenced many people of my generation. I'm older than you are, but my generation and your generation, but certainly mine,
Yeah,
because we had contact with him.
sure, sure. I mean, obviously, like the first book that comes to mind is Orientalism, written in
Yeah.
1978. Um, and I think Orientalism, it's a real attempt to place a framework around this whole study of, at least in Edward's work, of literary works and the artistic and literary output of Europe, particularly in the 19th century, and how the European project of imperial colonization is embedded in those works, particularly through representations of the Middle East and Arab cultures. And those representations are highly exoticized, or they're somewhat kind of uh, latent or retarded in some perspective. And I think, that's a compelling sort of, it's a remarkably compelling argument by which you can start to look at the works of the great 19th century writers, particularly, as extensions of an imperial project. Um, and so, yeah, he spends a lot of time looking at mostly French and British writers for that reason.
Yeah.
And then the follow up to that is culture and imperialism. And I think culture and imperialism starts to move, which I think was written at this point now, like 15 years later in the early 90s. Um, and that starts to move Edward's work, I think, much more into the public eye. And um, and there, he perhaps has one of the most compelling post-colonial case studies of opera ever written, which is his chapter on Aida, which is just kind of a remarkable study of Aida that I sat with very, very closely when I was doing my doctoral dissertation on Coptic chant, which is the obviously the indigenous chant system of the Coptic Church of Egypt.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, sorry, I can keep going about Edward's work,
No,
but
I know, and
yeah.
I'm fine with that because I'm happy to cover him with someone who really feels his work, and who can explain his work. Um, I also knew him as sort of, and forgive the adjective, but you'll understand, a silly opera fan, which meant that, he was not a silly man in any way, but there was just something very elementally emotive about his reaction to opera when he liked it. The kind of thing we
Yeah,
love with opera fans, where he put aside the intellect and the erudition and the politics and all of that, and he would just gush.
he would. With
And
the
it's,
exception of the only time he really took the same, like, he was so incisive of someone like Joseph Conrad, and had so much incredible things to say about the literary output of the European project of colonization in the 19th century. The only time he really applied that to opera was particularly in Aida. He didn't
Yeah.
really go beyond that, and I always found that to be a little funny.
But I even saw him just enthuse over a great Amneris in
Oh
the
yeah,
judgment scene because he loved her performance.
oh yeah,
And it had nothing to do with all the things that he understood about the opera Aida and its background. But it was just the thrill of hearing a mezzo really chew all the scenery and have to have the splinters removed from her teeth after because she was so
and
over the
and
top.
and I think this is kind of where I start to bristle at where our discourse is today, because there is this kind of contra narrative, like it's binary, you're either for or against something. I think what's so compelling about Edward Said and who he was is that he could be incisive about these great works of literature on the one hand, but still admire and love them on the other. So like we have to apply some nuance and subtlety to the reading of these works. Yes, Orientalism is a critical concept, but insofar as it is a critical concept, it's a way of framing how this output existed and this work existed. It doesn't mean that you hate Beethoven or hate Mozart or hate any of the remarkable canonic works of Western intellectual history. So this kind of zero sum game, absolutist sort of binary is I think it's been kind of a challenge, because it really wants to put people in camps.
When I'm called upon to teach Aida, which I'm called upon to teach Aida constantly because for many people it's their first opera, and they'll say, "Let's get a coffee and can you tell us about Aida?" And I will, and I've taught at universities and so on. There's something that I add that I don't recall if Edward in his writings did this, but because I'm an Italianist by studies, that's why half of my ashes are going there. Um, he did some revisions to the opera. It premiered in Egypt in 1869. He was
Yeah,
supposed to have done Rigoletto.
yeah,
He was supposed to have done, let me get this right, to open the Khedivial Opera
that's
House.
right.
It was originally Aida, but they did Rigoletto, but then they did Aida. But
That's right.
in the meantime, in Italy and in Europe, because there was the Franco-Prussian War, and Italy was a new country, and Rome had become the capital after it was Torino for a while, and then
Yeah,
briefly Florence. Um, that he redid some of the ending, especially the character of Amneris, who becomes something of a spokesperson for Verdi about his concerns about the future of Italy.
hmm hmm
Because the way the Egyptians and Ethiopians in the opera, and you can take two opposing sides of whatever work you want to take. Verdi felt that the new fragile young Republic of Italy, the constitutional monarchy, was going to collapse.
yeah,
And so he added the repetition of the word pace, peace, several times because Aida has died with Radames, and the remaining person is Amneris, and conceivably could rule Egypt on her own rather than take a husband. What we don't know, but the point
mm,
is the lack of knowing what the future will bring. Amneris speaks for Verdi in invoking peace because Italy was about to come apart almost as soon as it became a nation after having been divided for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so, yes, there's the spectacle, but to me, it's a very intimate opera about Verdi's beliefs because he had not written an opera for a while. He had retired to his farm and he revised Boccanegra. He revised a couple, not Boccanegra, he revised a couple of other operas, Macbeth, Ballo, and
yeah,
so forth, worked on Don Carlo. And after Aida, he didn't plan to write another opera. And he did not for quite
yeah.
a while until Otello and then finally Falstaff. Let's, if you want, talk about Otello and how.
Hmm. I want to talk more about Aida, but okay.
Talk about Aida. Go ahead, and then we'll talk about Otello. No,
I mean,
really, go right ahead.
I think Verdi took time away. He was smarting from, I think, the challenges he had with Don Carlos, and like that was that was an opera that had multiple renditions and was in fits and starts. But I always found it so fascinating that Ismail Khedive, or Khedive Ismail, um, commissioned Verdi. Like what was he thinking? And Khedive Ismail's commissioning of Verdi for Aida was as much about realpolitik as Verdi sort of um, I think Verdi trying to write in a little bit the history of the Risorgimento in Aida. And Khedive Ismail was
I'm just going to translate.
effectively
Risorgimento means resurgence. It was the national movement on the Italian peninsula that led to the unification of Italy in 1861.
thank you. Sorry.
Yeah.
But I think that Khedive Ismail, he was trying to secure Egyptian independence from the Ottoman Empire, which was kind of crumbling at that time anyway. We're talking about like the 1860s, 1870s. And the uh and he was trying to assert Egyptian autonomy through some cultural artifacts. And there's a quote that he has in like the 1870s where he says something like, Egypt is no longer in Africa. We're now part of Europe. We need to abandon our former ways and adopt a new system adapted to our social conditions. And this is the framework of Khedive Ismail. And when you think about it that way, it makes a lot of sense that he would go out of his way and pay a kingly sum at the time.
Oh,
I don't remember how many florins it was, but it was a lot. I think I remember writing a paper on this. It's like probably $500,000 today
yeah.
for Verdi to write Aida.
He got his money's worth, as far as I'm
He
concerned.
did, and I don't think Verdi ever really cared to go to Egypt. I mean, it's like that was he sent Camille Deloc to do his bidding for him.
Right. And there are these letters that we can read, the correspondence
That's right.
between,
Yeah.
and it's very interesting. But I think Verdi just decided that opera Aida will be for Egypt, but then the Aida that was done at La Scala in 1872, starring Teresa Stoltz, who became a very important figure in his life, as once his wife died, Teresa Stoltz, I don't know if they had a physical relationship, but they were a team, and it was Stoltz who helped build Verdi's retirement home for musicians. Um,
Mm,
and when Verdi died, January 27th, 1901, he was buried in the talk again about composer burials in the Cimitero Monumentale in Milan, which is the great cemetery where Toscanini is and Vladimir
that's
Horn.
right. Yeah.
But Teresa Stoltz had the idea to move Verdi's body, his remains, as well as that of his wife, Giuseppina Strafoni, to the rest home for musicians, because that's where the musicians could thank Verdi and visit him, and better there than a cemetery, because he gave life to the musicians who continued.
Mm,
Um, and a lot of the money from Aida basically built this rest home in Milan. Um, if we can, let's talk a bit about Othello, because right now on Broadway, New York, this being
oh
April
yeah.
11th of 2025, is a new production of Shakespeare's Othello with Denzel Washington and Jake Gyllenhaal
Hmm.
as Othello and Iago. And I think it's one of those cases where the opera is better than the play. It's a great
Hmm.
play. What's notable about the play is that, yes, people die in quick succession, but not as many as King Lear or Hamlet or some of the others.
Hmm.
Um, and therefore, it's about the cultural issues, the racial issues. The issue of Othello being a Muslim is sort of dispensed of at the beginning of the opera when he talks about Gloria Musulmano, Muslim glory, but for a Christian cause, because he is a warrior for Venice, and he's
Hmm.
married to Desdemona, who is a Catholic and white. And
Hmm.
right now in on Broadway, of course, we have a black actor playing this black character
Hmm.
who
Hmm.
is known as the Moor, which means
Hmm.
Moroccan or from the Maghreb in northern Africa. Um, but it's an opera that has become so fraught with issues and debate around the opera that it's
Hmm.
getting harder and harder to see and do that opera in a way that I think acknowledges its greatness. For many people,
You
it's Verdi's greatest
you mean
opera.
in terms of representation?
Representation of you use makeup, but
Yeah.
also the fact that more overtly than I think any opera, we know that the character is a person of color, whatever that
Yeah.
means, and that the woman is white, blonde usually, and even though Venetians are not necessarily white and blonde, but now certain companies don't want to use makeup to suggest that Othello is a man from North Africa. He doesn't have to be shoe polished black the way Laurence Olivier and early Placido Domingo were. Domingo evolved in the character to have a more realistic makeup, but initially he really was, sort of a caricature of a black African in terms of his makeup. But I think it is important that we understand that this is an issue in the opera. And um, Lena Horne, beautiful, beautiful actress, wore makeup called Egyptian Number 2, made by Max Factor. And that was the color it was called. And
I think Anna Netrebko did the same shade for Aida.
Anna the Trev was darker than Egyptian Number 2. She was about Egyptian Number 5, I think. But
Okay. All right.
but no, but the thing is, it's a sensitive issue. I recently saw an Othello, the opera production, in which the man singing Othello was from the Baltic, and he was very white and he had very blue eyes. And there was no attempt, you don't have to blacken him up, but you couldn't even find him in the crowd because he looked like everybody else. And the point is that this great hero doesn't look like everybody else, despite his being blacker, darker, through his military courage and genius, he rises and becomes the hero that he is. And I'm troubled when we are trying to bend so over backwards that we're losing the story.
Yeah, so I mean I think part of the rage or the frustration, which I see as justifiable, um, is from people of color, is that there are talented people of color who can act these roles and sing these roles. And historically, partly they have been passed over or they were not there because there wasn't access to the education, to the training to get them there. But the talent level is there. I concede that, and I think we as an industry should concede that. I also think the funny thing about all of this is that opera has never been about realism. It's a fantastical genre. I mean, we've got people. How many? How long is Violetta's death in La Traviata? I mean, she sings Addio del Passato, and she keeps on dying and dying and dying and dying. There's nothing about that that's
And she
realistic.
has
It's beautiful.
tuberculosis.
And she's tuberculosis, but she's singing at the top of her lungs. I mean, there's nothing about it that is realistic. It's not meant to be realistic. I think I struggle with opera when, and this happens often with modern opera. And by modern opera, I mean opera composed today, not Wozzeck. Um, I think what I struggle with is when operas become like ultra realist narratives. I think the best operas are operas that use the music and the fact that you're singing a narrative to create some kind of heightened sense of emotion, like true abstract expressionism. And you see that in works like Wozzeck. And I think Wozzeck is primarily a spectacular work of theater, not just an opera. It's like, especially a very good production of Wozzeck, it is truly theatrical.
Yeah.
Or uh, when you have a
But
modern
also
opera,
supported by musical passages without words. It's part of the
100%.
drama of
Yeah,
Wozzeck. Yeah.
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 Part of the drama of Upsec. I mean, a kind of naturalistic urge that exists in the music in and of itself. And then, like on the other hand, you have operas that are kind of about like that can be about some heightened magical realism, some kind of heightened fantasy, and I think that can be the domain not just of like Die Zauberflöte, not just of the Magic Flute. It's also the domain of Don Giovanni. I mean, there's that is a truly magical realist work that has the specter of death and hell and right and wrong and morality kind of metered out in the plainest, most theatrically entertaining terms. So I think we need to kind of just like simmer down a little bit and understand that opera is best when it embraces those elements that I think are not necessarily about embracing realism, but like embracing some kind of heightened emotion and some kind of expressionism and some kind of fantasy. And I think that that's where opera should and could be more successful as a modern art form. But I think there's a lot of parsing between composers, directors, singers that are on board with that. And I think that becomes the challenge of the curator and the administrator.
I fully agree. I would only disagree with one small aspect that in any given time, there are very few men in the world of any size, shape, or color who can sing Verdi's Othello.
I agree.
And we
I don't
have to
disagree with
get the
that.
person who can sing it best. If we're lucky to have a Russell Thomas, an American of African descent, who's a magnificent tenor and he's black and a wonderful actor, then we want him to sing Othello, but he's not always available for that role. He sings all kinds of opera, and God bless him because he's a wonder. But um, if it happens that the person who can sing Othello best is Canadian or Mongolian or Peruvian or Nigerian, it doesn't matter at all. It matters that he can sing the part well because,
But but what I'm saying is that I don't really care who the singer is.
yeah,
The onus is on the director to actually make Othello feel like Othello.
yeah.
Othello doesn't need to put blackface on to feel like Othello. The director needs to be intelligent and brave and imaginative enough to make Othello stand out in the way that Shakespeare intended and that Boito interprets in the libretto, so that we can have an Othello that is, a great kind of magisterial presence, despite, the shortcomings of Venetian society when it was set. So I
Mhm.
think, to me, it needs to be about theater, not necessarily about representation. That's what I'm saying.
Now, because we do have a time constraint here, we know that you went to Oxford. We know what you studied. We know that you worked at Houston Grand Opera. We know that you spent 7 years in Berlin at the Barenboim Said Academy. We know more about Edward Said, and I'm glad for that. We know that you have taught. Um, and now you have a very important job, and you're still a young man, which is great to see a young man in an important job. As the CEO and general director of the Spoleto Festival USA. Let's get this out of the way. What is the Spoleto Festival in Italy? Not to mention Melbourne, Australia, but Italy, and how is it the same and how is it different from the one in Charleston, South Carolina?
So the festival in Italy is called La Festival dei Due Mondi, the Festival of the Two Worlds. It was founded by Menotti in 1955,
Giancarlo
and
Menotti.
Giancarlo Menotti, thank you. Uh, and he wanted to found a counterpart festival in North America. And so he sort of, I think, kind of went on this trip, like a series of junkets to scope out spaces, like reconnaissance trips.
Hmm.
Uh, and it's partly that Charleston in the 70s, and still does, has this relatively romantic, kind of idyllic, somewhat languid sort of sense of self that feels a bit Italianate. And that Charleston also has um, is eminently walkable and has all of these theaters and has all of these venues. And also, I think there was a pretty compelling charm offensive by the mayor of Charleston at the time, a guy
Hmm.
named Joe Riley, to compel Menotti to found the American Sister Festival in Charleston, South Carolina. So he founded it in 1977, and the two festivals were fairly close in the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s. And then in the 90s, um, Menotti left. There was a bit of a fracas, and the festivals kind of moved apart. And I actually think the Spoleto Festival in Italy, also in the 90s and then into the 2000s, after Menotti kind of receded, uh, was not as compelling as it was in at its height in the mid 20th century, mid to late 20th century. So Spoleto USA is a sister festival of La Festival dei Due Mondi, but it's organizationally and entirely independent. I mean,
Yeah.
the kind of work we discuss with each other, sometimes we compare notes, try to get each other on top of it, try to share productions and co-productions together and things like that. But actually, what has happened is that they've become very different models.
Yeah.
The reason why they're different models is because what exists in the US is a producing festival that has its own orchestra and its own chorus, which is built anew every single year through national auditions. I mean, we auditioned 513 orchestra. We had 513 orchestra auditions for 90 places this past year
Mm.
for the Spoleto Orchestra, and that's done through a national audition tour. Having those assets of an orchestra and a chorus built into the festival gives you so much more flexibility to be a producing entity rather than just a presenting entity.
Menotti, people should know, had a very strong presence in the United States. He
He
wrote
did.
operas in English, sometimes as a libretto, sometimes a composer. The Medium, The Council, the opera.
Council was Spoleto. That was Spoleto's opening year,
Yep,
1977.
the opera that opened the Metropolitan Opera House, the new one, in September 16th, 1966, was Antony and Cleopatra.
That's right.
Zeffirelli directing and Samuel Barber composing and Menotti libretto.
Hmm.
They, which is to say, Barber and Menotti were partners
Hmm.
in life as well as in work for many, many years. And then when they were no longer partners in life, they were still partners in work. Um,
Hmm.
and Menotti lived for a long time in Philadelphia and studied in Philadelphia, so down the road from where you
So
grew
did
up.
Barber. Yeah.
And so Barber, yes. And therefore, Menotti was often described as an Italian and American composer, not Italian American, but Italian and American, because he brought both sensibilities to it. A very practical man of the theater, understood audiences very well, and did not lower his standards artistically to appeal to audiences, but he knew what audiences would like,
Mm.
and he created those works. But the Festival of the Two Worlds in Spoleto, which is in Umbria, Umbria being the only province or region of Italy that's not in the Alps that has no shoreline.
That's right. It's landlocked.
It's
Yeah.
landlocked. It has the lake in the middle, Trasimeno.
It's also my favorite region in Italy.
Why?
My favorite wine is from Umbria. I also spent a lot of time in Spoleto, Italy, when I was in
So is
graduate
it
school.
Orvieto or the red one whose name I'm suddenly
Oh
forgetting?
no, no, it's the Montefalco, Sagrantino.
Montepalco. Okay, so I can
Yeah.
tell you about that wine. That wine was the official sacramental wine of the Catholic Church
The
because it was
what? The
deeply
Sagrantino di Montefalco.
yes, 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 Sagrantinos, Sagrantinos, Sagra,
Sagrantino.
sacred,
Now I realize.
sacrament,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it was deeply red. It had a rather saturated red color. The problem was that if the priest or the altar boy or whoever was serving and had a trembling hand, the drips of water got on the floors of the churches and stained the marble because it's such a deeply red. So
Yeah.
it stopped being the sacred wine for a long time, but remained a delicious wine that was adapted then for cuisine rather than for sacraments.
Mm.
And it's a delicious wine. Montefalco is known as La Ringhiera dell'Umbria. It's sort of in a high place where you can look out from Montefalco and see in all different directions. But for many people, the other great wine, Orvieto, the white, became
Mhm.
the sort of sacramental wine because it didn't stain the floors of the church.
Right. I did not know that.
Yep. But anyway, I worked there one summer. I was an assistant to Lena Wertmuller. And Lena Wertmuller, who's famous as a film director, but before that, she was a theater director. And she did a play that she wrote called Amore e Magia nella Cucina di Mama, Love and Magic in Mama's Kitchen, which was right up my alley. It was a very ripe, and I mean this is a good way, play about women in Italy and marital relations and mothers and daughters and grandmothers and multi-generational womanhood in Italy at that time. And it was great fun because those of us who worked on the production, lived in town, and we would meet the old Umbrian ladies who would come saying, "Vieni a mangiare con noi, come eat with us," and they would cook for us. And what's wonderful about Spoleto, Italy, is that the way that the people of this little hill town basically took to the festival of the 50s
Yeah.
and made it their own. And for a few months or weeks of the year, it turned into an international mecca. And then it went back to being a nice little hill town. I've been to South Carolina, but never to Charleston. I can
Mm.
imagine that there's a similar kind of hospitality,
Yeah.
um, and that you tell me about it because I've never been there.
So I think, especially after Spoleto USA was founded in the 70s and 80s, um, yeah, I think you had this kind of explosion of cosmopolitanism, of global art happening in what was at the time a relatively small, kind of sleepy town. Um, and I think what happened with Spoleto is that because Spoleto became such an important um, sort of it became so important to the cultural and actually economic ecosystem of Charleston. Charleston started to grow, and it actually attracted a lot of business and funding and people to Charleston. So if you look at our board, for example, it's a national board. You've got about a third of the board lives in Charleston full time. A third of the board are people that don't live in Charleston but have second homes here, and a third of the board are people that don't have second homes or live here but love the festival and come and spend time here. So
Mhm.
it's become kind of a very large entity. And I think there was a calculation that was done relatively recently in the 20 teens that is something like to the effect of over $1 billion of economic impact for Charleston has been because of Spoleto since 1977. And every single year, you're talking about, you know, pretty heady kind of eight-figure amounts of economic impact. You're talking about a lot of people coming into the city. People from 48 states, 13 countries. That excludes artists, all coming for a 17-day sojourn. Uh, and that's a long festival for a festival that is this intense. I mean, this isn't a festival that takes place over 6 weeks and you have one or two performances a day. This is a festival that's 17 days with 120 performances in the 17-day period. So it's like a full season jammed into 17 days. So that averages out to be like five performances a day.
Yeah.
It's an extremely in terms of activity, it's extremely intense. I think it's probably the primary interdisciplinary performing arts festival in the country. And on top of that, it produces and creates new work all the time. I mean, having a slate of world premieres and US premieres is part of our DNA. A lot of that is because of Menotti, and a lot of that is also because of my predecessor, Nigel Redden,
Yeah.
who made sure both at Spoleto and at the other festival he ran at Lincoln Center that
Yeah.
these were bracing places of avant-garde expression. Um, and so
That's where I
I
knew Nigel was from here
right, right,
because I've never been to Charleston, but he brought that model, but used the spaces at Lincoln Center in a
correct.
period in the summer when there was a bit quiet,
A bit of a lull, yeah,
bit of a lull.
and yeah, and I think there aren't enough arts organizations and cultural organizations right now that truly turn to an artist and say, "Be ambitious, dream big." And this is not an organization that has the largest budget or the largest endowment or et cetera, et cetera, but it is a festival. And
Hmm.
as a festival, it's event. It has its own gravitas. It's an event. We put on an
Yeah.
event rather than a season. And I think that allows us to be ambitious and experimental in a way that sometimes, a performing arts center or an opera company or a ballet company or a symphony can't be. So it's something that I really relish. And quite frankly, we were in Berlin in 2021, like during the pandemic, and our son was born on March
March
16,
16th.
2020. Yeah,
I
the
know.
first day of the lockdown in Berlin. And there were few places that I could think about for like the next step of my career in the United States. Very few, and Spoleto was basically one of them. It's the only one that I could think of at the time because I started to create and curate these festivals at the Boulez Zal and
Yeah.
with the Barenboim Said Academy, and I got obsessed with this
Well, let's pause on
idea.
that. So Boulez
Yeah,
Sal, named for Pierre Boulez, who this year would have been 100. Talk a
correct.
little bit about Pierre Boulez, who I knew when I was a kid here in New York, but a major figure as well.
Right. And
Yeah.
and actually one of the pieces on my list is the second sonata that I gave you
Yeah.
for the Adagio. That's Polini's performance. But Boulez is I think, similarly to Menotti, but in a completely different kind of vein aesthetically, was this creator of art and work in this industry, specifically in classical music, not just as a composer and not just as a conductor, but as an institution builder. And I think, that's something to have this concert hall in the heart of Germany, in the heart of Berlin, bear his name is an homage to that.
Yeah. Um, let's talk a bit about the Spoleto. Number one, give us the website right now. We'll repeat it at the end
All
so
right,
that people can, yeah,
SpoletoUSA.org. S P
SPOLETOUSA
dot org.
dot
Yeah,
org.
no,
Okay,
no, no, just SPOLETOUSA.org.
got it. And it's May 22nd to June 8th of this year of 2025, correct?
May 22nd is our gala. The festival opens on May 23rd.
Okay. You have two operas coming. A couple of years ago, I had Nicole Heaston as my guest on the show as she was preparing to do Barbara's Vanessa, which
That's
she
right. Yeah.
recently sang in Washington, but I had her on talking about the opera before she did it in Charleston.
Yeah,
And
it's
I
Spoleto.
can send that to you, or viewers can also go to YouTube and enter Fred Plotkin, Nicole Heaston, Heaston, and find that very interesting conversation. She's
She's
coming back
fabulous.
this year
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
Thais.
That's Thais. That's right.
Go ahead. Why Thais?
Yeah. I mean, Nicole was so deeply compelling as in Vanessa. And compelling as an actor, not just as a singer. I mean, she has such a presence on stage. Um, and the person who was conducting Vanessa at the time, Tim Myers, who's now the festival orchestra director, you know, sort of said to me, I think in the middle of last year or something like that. He's like, I think Nicole would do Thais. That could be really interesting. I'm like, I love Thais. It's rarely ever done. I think most people only know the Meditation, and I don't think people don't really know a lot about early Christian Cenobitic monasticism in Egypt, let
Right.
alone anything else. So for me, it was a fascinating prospect to potentially do it. We're doing it as a co-production with Austin Opera, and the director is Crystal Manich, and it is a semi-staged production, but a deeply fully involved semi-stage production. So it's a concert staging that really uses a lot of the stage with the orchestra on stage. I think the best way to describe it is that it's just an opera staging with the orchestra on stage.
By the way, Annie Burrage, who's the head of the opera in Austin, Texas, will be my guest on the show July 11th or 18th, if I remember. But she'll be
Oh,
here.
fabulous.
Yeah,
She's great. Yeah,
she's
we're
great.
great friends. Yeah.
And the other opera you're doing is Benjamin Britten's Turn of the Screw, which is a wonderful, I want to say perfect opera. And practically, it's a perfect opera.
Oh, I'm so glad you're saying it's a perfect opera. I should quickly say that the Thais is with Nicole Heaston and Troy Cook. So,
Yes, sorry.
yeah, no, that's okay.
As
Um,
Athanael.
as a Panayel.
Yeah.
Uh, Turn of the Screw to me is one of my all-time favorite pieces. I mean, it is bone-chilling and creepy uh and it's first of all, it's a great work of literature by Henry James. And I mean, you've got this strange story told in a it has all the things you want of a ghost story, of a Victorian Gothic ghost story, a windswept manor, creepy children. It has everything that you want in a ghost story, and we're doing it in the first purpose-built theater in America, the Dock Street Theater,
Hmm.
which is by many accounts haunted. And the person who is creating that production, the director of that production, is Radula Gaetano, who did our production of Vanessa in 2023. And she just fell in love with the Dock Street, and the whole piece is this kind of love letter to the Dock Street. So playing on its own haunted element, the Dock Street Theater is sort of extended onto the stage. And there's these two-way mirrors, and there's this kind of element that not everything you see is actually happening in front of you. It's very illusory. So it's going to be an exciting world premiere production. They're both world premiere productions.
Then you have theater, dance. I'm speaking quickly, instrumental music, chamber, orchestral, jazz, and you have vocal appearances. One of them being the very famous Patti Smith, who's a big
That's
opera
right.
lover. I see her at the
She's
Metropolitan
awesome.
Opera all the time.
Yeah.
But you also have one of my very favorite singers of all, Mavis Staples.
Oh, yeah. Are you coming to
Mavis,
the festival this year, Fred? You've got to come,
I'm
clearly.
not, unfortunately. I can't explain why. I'm not, unfortunately. Would that I could, but I can't.
Okay.
But Mavis Staples is just the greatest, and I've loved
She
her for
is.
decades and decades. And she, for people who don't know her, she won the Kennedy Center honor. She is was in the civil rights movement. She still is. She sings gospel. She was the love of Bob Dylan's life. I mean, all kinds of things about her. But
She was the voice of the civil rights movement. I
she
mean,
was the voice. Yeah,
yeah,
with Mahalia Jackson, I would say the
with
two.
Mahalia Jackson. Yeah.
And but the thing about Mavis has a very deep, beautiful voice, and the way she knows, because she's, I guess, past 80 now, whether she's in good voice, how she warms up. You know how Mavis warms up,
I don't.
and you'll ask her to do this for you when you meet her. She goes, "Yes, no, yes, no," and she expands her voice, saying yes and no. It's a
Wow.
fantastic thing to watch until she
I
has
mean,
filled the range that she feels she needs. And then it's
yeah.
yes. She's ready to sing.
She's turning 86 in July.
86. Okay, yeah.
So like whatever she's doing, it's working. You know?
Um, I love all of her music. I think Soldier in the Army of the Lord may be my favorite.
Hmm.
I hope she sings that. She's magnificent. And let's see, that is May 30th. So y'all, if you're in the South, they're doing Turn of the Screw that night in June 1st, and they have a lot going on right at the same time. Get down to Charleston.
That's right. We also have the world premiere of all of Alyssa Weilerstein's fragments.
My
Uh,
goodness,
so
the
so it's
cellist, yeah.
the cellist. So that's six performances. Yeah.
Wow. Now, we've given the website. We'll do it again, spoletousa.org. I want to conclude by, well, I want to say one thing, and you can agree or disagree as you wish. Um, Charleston famously is the place in the South, one of the places in the South that was very resolute in the war in the 1860s.
Oh
It was
yeah.
where Rhett Butler was in Gone with the Wind. It's also known to be the place that was either the first or second venue in North America for opera. People in
That's
New
right. Yeah.
Orleans say that they were first. People in Charleston say that they were first. I only know that New York City was second and the other southern city came third. But
Right.
opera goes very, very far back in Charleston. As I said, I've not been there, but I know it to be a city of great culture, but also of identity, of its own identity. And we were speaking before about Edward Said and about Daniel Barenboim. We were speaking about um, colonialism, about identity, about Germany, Eastern and Western. And I would love in Italian, there's a concept senza frontiere, without borders.
Hmm.
And if you look at a bird and it takes off in Udine, northeastern Italy, and lands in Slovenia or lands in Austria, it's not cognizant of the borders that were drawn by humans between those places. The rivers flow between, the mountains are there. In my view, it's really all of our earth for all of us. We have to protect it.
Mm.
And, I love festival. I took part in a festival called Senza Frontiere in the northeast of
Mm.
Italy that actively promotes this concept that yes, there are ways that we can find to define ourselves as being different from this one or that one, but that ultimately if we believe in a creator, we're all created as equals. We all participate. We only have this planet. I don't care what Elon Musk says. This is the only place we have, and we really have to take care of it. And as you correctly said, there's so much that art and the arts can teach us and bring down the borders. And finally, my answer for world peace is the following: we teach every citizen, every child, to read music
Mm.
because that will give us a common language. I
Mm.
remember that I was once working in the far north of Norway in 1992, and it's largely people of Norwegian, Scandinavian origin, but also the Sami, the local people known as the Laps. And there's a community of people there from Sri Lanka who were
Mm.
brought because they were adept at fishing and fish canning and all of that. And what united these people was not the way they might have looked different, it doesn't matter. They all could read music. Part of the
Oh, wow.
policy in Norway was that everyone read music. So that when I went to a church service on a Sunday, I was not of that faith, but I wanted to go and see local people. Everybody was sight singing, from little
Wow.
children to old people. The Sri Lankans, the Samis, the traditional Scandinavians, whoever they were all sight singing. And whenever I've been in places where everybody can sight sing or read music, there's a commonality that brings. It goes beyond speaking different languages and perhaps not speaking Tamil or Norwegian or English or whatever the language. And so that's my goal. If when I leave this world, I want to leave that behind as official UN policy, and I'd love to see it work because that if we can sing together, we can do other things together.
Mm.
I believe.
Yeah, I mean, it's also so deeply ingrained into who we are as human beings. I mean, you can go back pretty early to, ancient Mesopotamia, and one of the first things that is written down is a hymn, a sung hymn to the moon goddess. It's actually the first extant piece of written music that we have in world history. Um, but what was pretty clear is that using your voice and organizing it in a sort of melodic and euphonious manner was pretty important to us as a species fairly early on. Um, and I mean about Charleston, I mean it's such a kind of heady and intoxicating place to be right now. I mean, this was the birthplace of the Confederacy movement and the start of the American Civil War. Uh, it was the port of entry for the transatlantic slave trade.
Hmm.
Most of the ships in the Middle Passage disembarked and sold a lot of the um, enslaved people here. Um, and despite this kind of history, it has this incredible outward beauty and grace
Uh-huh.
that belies a tragic history. And I think again, that's there's a counterpoint there.
And
You have
recent
to,
tragic history, unfortunately,
of course,
Mother
yes, you
Emanuel's
have
murder.
the Mother Emanuel massacre, the
Yeah,
10th anniversary of which is upon us in June.
yeah, yeah.
Um, And so that recent history is a good point. Like this is not something you can easily shake. It's not something you elide over, and it's not something you sweep under the rug. You have to face the bones of this nation in order to be able to progress. And I think something like a festival, it can do it in its own way. And that's just one of the things that we're trying to do and have fun while doing it.
And just to conclude this, my belief is that if we sing together, as you said, it's one of the oldest human practices, we have to listen to each other in
That's
singing.
right.
And if we
Yeah.
develop the habit of listening carefully when we sing together, it's no longer just hearing the next person, it's actually listening. And that is something we need to do now. As Mavis would say, yes, no, yes, no, yes, yes.
I'm gonna ask her to do that.
So, Mena, Mark, Hannah, I want to thank you. I want to point out to listeners, of course, that my guest has provided us with a wonderful list of 6 selections from the Adagio catalog that mean a lot to him. You mentioned Maurizio Pollini playing Boulez and Stravinsky and Prokofiev, and there are other wonderful ones. And I commend that to you. And I commend, of course, that anyone who can get to Spoleto Festival USA this year, do try to do that, especially for Mavis Staples, but also Turner the Screw and everything else on the program. So, Mena Mark Hanna, thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Fred. It was
You're welcome.
very enjoyable conversation. Take care.
Thank you.